Okay, good morning, Shavuot Tov. This week is the Parsha of Vayetzei. Today, we're going to be learning about the story of Yaakov and his decision to marry two sisters. So we know the story where Yaakov, he goes to Haran and he meets the daughter of Lavan, which is Rachel, and it's what we sometimes call love at first sight, and he decides that he wants to marry her. However, through an act of deception and manipulation, Yaakov ends up marrying Leah. He works for 7 years, and it is Leah who he ends up with. And therefore, he tells Lavan that what's this whole bait and switch going on? So Lavan says, this is the practice. This is the way things are here. You marry the older one, then you marry the younger one. So that's why I gave you my daughter Leah. So Yaakov commits to work another 7 years, and ultimately he marries Rachel as well. So today we're going to analyze this concept, this phenomenon of Yaakov marrying two sisters. Today we're going to focus on Rachel and Leah. The truth is Bilhah and Zilpah also were daughters of Lavan, but that's a separate discussion. Now, we're going to view this whole discussion through the lens of Rashi, which Rashi, as we've discussed many times, his methodology and the basis of his interpretation is what we know as Pshuto Shel Mikra, which means the literal translation, the simple meaning, not allegorical, not the deep mystical explanations, which sometimes we may find alluded to in the words of Rashi, but Rashi, his main premise is to explain the Torah from a literal perspective. So this is a very, very basic, simple question. We know in the Torah, it says that you're not allowed to marry two sisters. It's a clear pasuk in the Parsha of Vayikra, in the Parsha, in the Chumash of Vayikra, where it says that it's a very basic prohibition, but just to quote the exact source, in Parshas Achrei, Parak Yudches, Pasuk Yudches, Ve'isha elachosa lo sikach, that you should not take a woman in addition to her sister, litzrar, to make them rivals through this union. So, clear pasuk in the Torah, you're not allowed to marry two sisters, and yet Yaakov, he transgresses this sin. Now you're going to say, okay, very nice. That's a pasuk in the Parsha of Achrei, which was given to the Jewish people with the Torah. And Yaakov, this whole saga took place many, many years before the giving of the Torah, so he was not obligated. He didn't have to fulfill the Torah. However, we can't say that because we've discussed this, in fact, in the last couple of weeks, that there's a basic understanding and agreement that our ancestors, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Shvatim, they observed the entire Torah even before it was given. And specifically pertaining to Yaakov, we know that he fulfilled the mitzvahs, especially through the opinion of Rashi. As we know in the beginning of the Parsha of Vayishlach, Yaakov is sending a message to Esav, and he says, Im Lavan Garti, that I lived with Lavan, Garti. So Garti literally means he sojourned, he lived with Lavan, but Rashi says the word Garti, we could permutate the letters, and they comprise the word of Taryag 613, Im Lavan Garti v'Taryag mitzvah shemarti. I lived with Lavan and I observed the 613 mitzvahs. So Rashi is clearly of the opinion that Yaakov observed all the mitzvahs, which would include the prohibition against marrying two sisters. And yet, here in this parsha in Vayetzei, Yaakov seems to be in flagrant violation of this prohibition. And Rashi doesn't say anything. So one of the ways the Rebbe explains Rashi's methodology, generally speaking, if there is a problem, that if there is an issue, something that's not understood, Rashi will address it unless it's something that's self-understood. So if it's self-understood, there's no reason to address it because even a 5-year-old, a ben chamash l'mikra, which is the level of interpretation to which Rashi, of education, to which Rashi is interpreting the Torah to, that level of background, if a 5-year-old would intuitively know the answer, he would not say it. But if there is some question or dilemma, Rashi will address it. But we don't find anywhere, not here. You're going to say, well, maybe the prohibition is later in Parashat Achri, but Rashi never addresses in his commentary as to why Yaakov was permitted to marry the two sisters. So he observes all the mitzvahs, and yet he still marries Rachel and Leah. So we need to understand why he was permitted to do that. So we see that in general, the Torah and the halacha address pretty much all scenarios, and they tell you what to do and not to do. Clearly, over here, there was more. There must have been some explanation or context why he was permitted. So before we get to the explanation, the way the Rebbe explains the perspective of Rashi, we will present several answers that have been given throughout the generations, because indeed, this is not just a question that you'll say, whatever, it wasn't such a big deal. Many, many commentators raise this question. And that is why it's so shocking that Rashi does not raise it, because everyone else wonders and is perplexed and is startled as to why Yaakov is permitted to do this, and they all present different answers, and Rashi doesn't. So it is sometimes not what Rashi says, it's what he doesn't say that needs the clarification, and that's what we will do shortly. But first, we'll present several of the interpretations that have been presented. So one fascinating explanation is presented by the Ramban, Nachmanides, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, and he says as follows. He says that the Avos, this premise that they fulfilled all the mitzvahs of the Torah, even before it was given, it was only so in Eretz Yisrael. That is to say, they only fulfilled all of the mitzvahs when they were in the land of Israel. When they were in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, that was not the case, which this itself is a fascinating perspective, which he elaborates on a little bit. And briefly, the idea is that there's something very, very intrinsically unique and holy about Eretz Yisrael. And that is the way the Avos would connect to Hashem in that region through observing the mitzvahs of Hashem. And he explains that throughout the world, we know that in each region, each country, there's a special sar, a minister, that has the control, the dominion of that land, and through which all of the various processes and decisions and divine energies and influences are processed through that minister. However, there is one land that there is no agent or intermediary, and that is the land of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has no sar, has no minister except Hashem. Hashem himself, it's directly under his dominion. As we know, the pasuk tells us in the parsha of Yisro, where Hashem tells the Jewish people, "Ki atem you'll be a mamlechas kohen and kodesh, you'll be a nation, a kingdom of priests. Ki li kol haaretz, because the entire land is mine." So he explains that the Eretz Yisrael was directly under the sovereignty and the rulership, the dominion of Hashem. And therefore, there was this unique relationship between Hashem and the Bnei Yisrael there, because ultimately, what are the mitzvahs? The mitzvahs are what express and manifest and reveal the relationship between Hashem and the Yidden, and that's where it took place primarily in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you'll say, why is that? Why is it different today? Because in every mitzvah, there's two components. There is the fact that Hashem, we observe a mitzvah of Hashem that He commanded us, regardless of the content of the symbolism or the meaning of the mitzvah. And then there's the meaning itself. In other words, when we blow shofar, there's two things happening. One thing is we're doing what Hashem wants, regardless. It could be blowing the shofar, it could be eating matzah, it could be shaking the lulav. Every mitzvah is the same because we're all doing one thing, obeying Hashem's will. But then each mitzvah also has its detail, its unique dimensions, properties that it has, which from that perspective, each mitzvah is different. And so therefore, when the Jewish post-Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, at the end of the day, all the mitzvahs we observe is because Hashem gave it to us, because Hashem commanded us, do this, don't do that. So therefore, we have to observe the mitzvahs regardless where we are, because regardless of the significance of the mitzvah, Hashem commanded us, we need to obey. But prior to Matan Torah, all the mitzvahs that the avos, that our ancestors observed, it wasn't because they were commanded to do. They did it because of their own personal stringency. They wanted to accept upon themselves to do mitzvahs. So therefore, they only observed the mitzvah where there was a relevance, which was in the relationship they had with Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. Anyways, this is not the opinion of all the commentators. This is what the Ramban suggests. He in fact brings an interesting support to this. We find later, after Yaakov marries, the core of his answer is that's why Yaakov was allowed to marry Rachel and Leah, the two sisters, because where did this marriage take place? In Haran, in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora. Therefore, it was permitted because they did not observe all the mitzvahs outside of Eretz Yisrael. And he supports this because if we look later on, what happens? We read about the death of Rachel, which took place when they came back. So the Eretz Yisrael is this land, it's very, very holy. It cannot tolerate the transgression. And therefore, right away, Rachel passes away because as they come to Eretz Yisrael, Yaakov can no longer remain married to the two sisters. So it's an interesting explanation. And that would address the question, why and how was he allowed to do it? But obviously, Rashi, we cannot explain this according to the opinion of Rashi. Why not? Because we just explained before that Rashi says that Yaakov says, I fulfilled all the mitzvahs, im Lavan garti, b'tarig mitzvah shamarti. With Lavan I lived, and I observed all the mitzvahs. Where did that take place? Also in Haran. So Yaakov is saying that even in Chutz La'aretz, even in the diaspora, he still observed all 613 mitzvahs. So the explanation of Ramban as to why Yaakov was allowed to marry the two sisters would work for the Ramban, but it would not work for the opinion of Rashi. Now, there are, and in fact, Rashi is not the only one. The Or HaChaim also disagrees with the Ramban. He says, what's the difference? At the end of the day, fulfilling a mitzvah of Hashem, the Avos, why would they fulfill it only in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz? You're fulfilling the mitzvahs of Hashem. So there are others, other Rishonim, other commentators that disagree with the opinion of Rashi, with the opinion of the Ramban. Then there's another explanation, which is presented by various commentators, and that is, there's the concept known as gerus, of conversion. There is a premise that gerushin is gayer, kekatan shenoladam, that a convert, a person who was converted, is deemed to be a newborn, someone that is as if they were just born with a whole new life. And therefore, if we assume that there was a gerus, in other words, Yaakov would have presumably converted the sisters Leah and Rachel, and therefore there would be even though biologically they would still be sisters, from a halachic point of view, since it's as if they were just born, therefore they would not be deemed halachically as sisters. So that's an explanation that some present, which the Rebbe rejects for various reasons. Number one, it's not clear that Yaakov would have needed to convert Rachel and Leah. Why would he convert them? Because ostensibly Yaakov is fulfilling all the mitzvahs, he's a Jew, and they were born to Lavan, which was not Jewish. Avram was the first Jew, and he had his family with Sarah and Yitzchak and Yaakov, and therefore they would have to convert them. But hang on a second. If we say that this is before the giving of the Torah was not given, there was no command to fulfill mitzvahs. So what exactly is the status? All the observance, all the mitzvahs and the Torah that they're observing is a personal stringency. It's something that they accept upon themselves. They didn't have to put on tefillin, they didn't have to eat kosher, they didn't have to keep Pesach and so on, but they decided to do it. Now, someone else who hasn't been doing it to that point, say the household of Lavan with his daughters Rachel and Leah, so they could just begin observing the mitzvahs. There's no process of gear, conversion. Conversion from what? It's not like they're converting from being a non-Jew to a Jew, because all the mitzvahs anyway were just something that they accepted upon themselves. It wasn't they were commanded by Hashem. So it's not clear that there would be a necessity, a requirement for gerus. Number two, it's not the whole notion of saying Gershon is Garik Katan Shenola, to say that someone who converts is like a new person, that itself is also problematic, because we know the Torah, we read before the pasuk in Parshas Achrei, it says that one should not marry two sisters. So there is the mitzvah, or the losa say not to marry the two sisters. But the Torah also says something interesting, that they should not to cause jealousy and enmity. In other words, the Torah is adding a psychological dimension to this prohibition, that two sisters who are two biological sisters, there's a natural love and very, very strong relationship between the two. Were one to marry two sisters, it would breed a divisiveness, a jealousy, and competition, which we want to avoid. So the Torah gives that reason. So if this is the case, if two sisters go through a conversion, yes, halachically, maybe we'll say they're considered two different sisters. But at the end of the day, they're two sisters. So that has not changed. Their natural love will not dissipate, it will not diminish because they went through a gerus process. So therefore, we would still have the issue if two sisters, even if they were Megayer, they went through the conversion, there's still a concern that there'll be jealousy, there'll be enmity between them. And if so, it would still be prohibited. So we're still back to the question as to why the Yaakov was allowed to marry the two sisters. We'll present one more answer. This is from the Parashas Drachim and others who say that Yaakov had a prophecy, a divine commandment from Hashem. Hashem told him to marry the two sisters because we know ultimately from the marriage, there would be the 12 Shvatim, and that's from the divine providence, how it was orchestrated, it was meant to be. Which the Rebbe also rejects this because we don't see anywhere in the Torah, at least in Pshuto Shel Mikra, which this is Rashi's basic premise, we don't see anywhere Hashem told Yaakov, go marry two sisters. In fact, if you read the narrative, what was the reality? The reality was Yaakov wanted to marry Rachel. He didn't want Leah. He only married Leah because he was connived and deceived by Lavan. And because he already married Leah, he decided, let's go ahead and we'll just marry Rachel too. But from the basic reading of the Torah, it would seem that Yaakov only wanted to marry Rachel, and there was no command to marry the two sisters. So in summation, we have the question that we started out with: why and how could Yaakov marry two sisters? We presented three answers. The answer of the Ramban, who says that the Avos only fulfilled and observed the mitzvahs while they were living in Eretz Yisrael. In the diaspora in Chutz La'aretz, they did not observe, and therefore Yaakov, who married Rachel and Leah in Haran, so there was no issue. And we said that doesn't fit with Rashi's opinion because Rashi maintains that in Lavan Garti, he did fulfill the mitzvahs while he was by Lavan and Haran. We have the explanation that, and other reasons why Rashi would not agree with that. We have the explanation that the Rachel and Leah went through a conversion, and therefore they're like newborns, and therefore there's no halachic relationship between the two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Rashi could not accept this. At least there would still be a natural love, and it's not clear even in general there was a need for a conversion. And finally, to the answer that there was a divine command, it's not clear from that he should marry two sisters. It's not clear that there was such a command. And in fact, from reading the narrative, it would seem that Yaakov only wanted to marry one, Rachel, and not the other, Leah. So we've gone through a few options, some of the explanations that are given. And now we will present the Rebbe's novel insight explanation, which also, it's not just an explanation to satisfy our question as to why Yaakov was allowed to do something that happened thousands of years ago. In fact, there's a very, very powerful lesson and a very, very practical application in our lives today. So what we see here, we must say that clearly there was a prohibition to marry two sisters. We're not going to discount that. So the only way we could sort of resolve this is to see, was there another obligation, another duty? In other words, if Hashem came to Yaakov and says, marry the two sisters, like the answer of Parshas Drachim, of course, Yaakov would have to fulfill Hashem's command and marry two sisters, albeit that it was contrary to another prohibition. Hashem told Avram, go bring your son as an akedah, as a carbon, right? So he, without even thinking twice, he was willing to do that, even though slaughtering Yitzchak would violate other commands. If you're told by Hashem to do something, you got to do it. But here, it's not clear that Hashem told him to do anything. So on the one hand, you have a prohibition. So what would be the other obligation that Yaakov would have, which would override this prohibition of marrying the two sisters? So the Rebbe says, we must say that Yaakov had there was another responsibility that he had to tend to. And because of that responsibility, that would override the prohibition of the Torah not to marry the two sisters. Because in life, obviously, sometimes our things are very, very clear. You open a Shulchan Aruch, you open the halacha, and it tells you this is what you should do in a certain case. But here, as we're soon going to see, it wasn't so black and white. There was a bit of a gray area. And Yaakov had to make he had to search within himself, and then he had to make a very, very tough decision, because there was no two good options, as we'll soon see. But it was Yaakov's ability to rise above the occasion, and to be able to make a very, very hard choice in life. What is the basic answer? The basic answer is that all the mitzvahs that the avos fulfilled, as we mentioned before, wasn't due to a command from Hashem. Hashem never told Avram, eat matzah. He never told him to shake a lulav, to put on tefillin. He never told him to do those mitzvahs. That command would only happen with the giving of a Torah. So in this era, all of the observance of the mitzvahs was a personal stringency, was accepted upon themselves. They decided they want to observe the Torah similar to the way we observe it today. So if it's only a personal stringency, it's a personal acceptance, if that were to run theoretically contrary, or would be in conflict with not a stringency, but an actual command, an actual duty. So on the one hand, you would have a mitzvah or an avera, do this or don't do that. Then you have your own personal chumrah. Which would come first? Your own personal decision to do a mitzvah or refrain from doing an avera? Or do you have to fulfill an actual mitzvah, actual command? So what kind of commands, what existed in those days? At best, we could come up with what we know as the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. There were the 7 Noahide laws, which were given in the era of Adam and Noach. And those were the mitzvahs that they actually had to fulfill. According to many opinions, in fact, the status of the Avos were like Noahides. That is to say, yes, Avram was a Jew, Yitzchak was a Jew, Yaakov was a Jew, but there was no actual duty to fulfill mitzvahs. That is to say, to keep Shabbos or other mitzvahs, because they weren't commanded yet. What were the only things which sort of mitzvahs were commanded in those days? The 7 Noahide laws. Okay. We have 7 Noahide laws, and then we have their personal stringencies. That is to say, he decided he wanted to eat the matzah, and he wanted on Pesach, he wanted to blow the shofar, those kind of mitzvahs as well. Now, the Rebbe introduces another concept. In addition to the 7 no-hide laws, there were other. Now, first of all, before we get to that area, what's the proof? How do you know that Yaakov or Avram or Yitzchak, the Sheva mitzvahs b'no Noach, would override the other mitzvahs of the Torah? The Rebbe brings an interesting example. Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu, he fulfilled ostensibly all the mitzvahs. There's one mitzvah he did not fulfill until he was 99. Which mitzvah is that? We know. It's the mitzvah of Milah. He waited all those years. He was devoted. At 70, we learned in Lech Lecha, 75, he was leaving his land and he was going to leave it all behind and going on the mission of Hashem. Earlier than that, he had Mesiras Nefesh. He had the Akedah, the Or Kasdim in the furnace, taking on Nimrod. So it wasn't like he was shying away from doing things that were difficult, right? As we discussed in the parsha of Lech Lecha. And yet, Milah, he knew about all the mitzvahs. Why did he not observe the mitzvah of Milah? Why did he wait till 99? So one of the classic answers is that Avram, we know there's a notion, there's mitzvah v'osa ve'einu mitzvah v'osa. Mitzvah v'osa, there's someone who's commanded and then observed, and then there's einu mitzvah v'osa, there's someone who's not commanded and still observes. In other words, all the mitzvahs that Avram observed till this point was of his own initiative. He wasn't commanded to do. So the problem was, Avram was afraid that if he performs the mitzvah of Milah, it's a one-time thing. Once he observes the mitzvah, he can no longer do it again. So he waited for Hashem to command. Okay, fine. But the Rebbe gives another explanation. And the Rebbe rejects this answer to a certain extent. We're not going to get into it. But one of the ideas we see from here is, why did Avram wait till he was 99? Because until he was 99, if he were to circumcise himself, he would injure himself and he would be drawing blood. One of the prohibitions of the Bnei Noach was shofech dam, to spill blood, which according to the commentators refers to even spilling one's own blood. Even if it did not cause a fatal injury, it was still prohibited. So Avram, on the one hand, he wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Milah, but that's a personal stringency. It's a personal decision. You want to observe this mitzvah. But one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is you're not allowed to spill blood. So here we see a precedent that an actual mitzvah versus a chumrah, the mitzvah wins the day. And therefore, Avram had to wait till he was 99. Now that he's 99, Hashem gave him the command, go circumcise yourself. So albeit one of the Shev mitzvah enough is not to spill blood, but Hashem commanded you not to do the milah. So therefore, it would be permitted. Now, the bottom line what we were trying to bring out here is that a mitzvah versus a chumrah, you have to observe the mitzvah. You have to dispense with a chumrah for that time. Now, which mitzvah, this is going back to our original question, which mitzvahs were they actually commanded to do those days? So we spoke about the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. But the Rebbe says there were other mitzvahs that appear that were relevant in those days also. For example, we don't find in the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach the mitzvah of kibud avayim, honoring one's parents. And yet, we must say there was such a mitzvah. How do we know? Because at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, it says Terach died. And if you compute the age of Terach dying and Avram, it happened many, many years later. In other words, in the Parsha of Lech Lecha, when Avram leaves, when he's 75, his father's still alive. So why does the Torah say Terach died? The answer is because it would be unseemly to say that Avram left his father in Haran and going to Eretz Yisrael. That means he did not fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Avayim. And because of that, the Torah says, well, his father passed away. We're not going to get into the minute to that. It's a whole it's a discussion itself. Why did Avram? Why was he permitted to leave his father? Why didn't he perform the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em? But in any case, the fact that we actually have to justify, the Torah has to say that Terach died, and we need to defend Avram that he didn't honor his parents. What do you mean? There's no mitzvah. So we see that there were certain, in addition to the Sheva mitzvah b'Noach, there were some basic principles of mitzvahs that were universally accepted at the time. Because part of the general thrust of the seven Noahide laws is that the world should be a place that's civilized and developed and live in harmony with each other. And therefore, some basic ground rules were established, such as honoring one's parent. Now, the Rebbe demonstrates that there was another mitzvah, or at least accepted practice, that everybody observed. And that is honesty, which is not clearly defined in the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Not to deceive. How do we know? Because Yaakov, upon discovering that he thought he married Rachel, but it was really Leah, he goes to Lavan and he says, Lama rimi sane, why have you deceived me? Why did you trick me? And what does Lavan respond to Yaakov? He doesn't say, "Oh, too bad. This is the welcome to the real world. You're naive, Ish Tam Yoshev Alim. You were studying in Shem Ve'ever all this year. Now this is the real world. This is how we work." He doesn't blow him off like that. He actually needs to defend his actions, and he says, "Listen, there's a practice over here. You don't come here and marry the young one before the older one. There's a system. There's a practice. There's a custom. First, we marry off the older girl, then we marry the younger girl." Lavan felt it necessary to defend the bait and switch because clearly it was universally accepted at that time that honesty, integrity was something that was a universally accepted practice. So therefore, if a person gives their word, if a person says something, they need to stand behind it. That wasn't just a personal chumrah. It actually was a universally accepted practice. And it was tantamount to one of the Sheva Mitzvot. So if we could demonstrate that Yaakov, he himself had a mitzvah that he had to fulfill, a personal, not just a personal decision, but he was actually responsible to fulfill a certain mitzvah, that would clearly override the chumrah of not marrying two sisters. So what was his responsibility? Well, Yaakov promised to Rachel that he would marry her. He gave her certain signs. He said, "This is our agreement and I will marry you." So now he was deceived. He married Leah. But however, he had a dilemma. What am I going to do now? On the one hand, I took upon myself a chumrah, a stringency, a decision that I'm going to fulfill all the mitzvahs of the Torah, including which I will not marry two sisters. I already married Leah. How could I go ahead and marry Rachel? On the one hand. On the other hand, I gave my word. I promised Rachel that I will marry her. This is not just a chumrah. This is everyone. You give your word. You give someone your assurance. You promise someone something. You need to stand behind it. So therefore, Yaakov came to the decision. If I gave my word, that is the mitzvah. And not marrying two sisters, that's a chumrah. My word, my honesty, my integrity needs to be the decisive factor. And therefore, I need to marry Rachel. This is an amazing, amazing insight that the Rebbe presents. And in fact, we see that in addition to that, we can make an interesting argument. Because at the end of the day, we ask the question, Torah gives an explanation why you should not marry the two sisters, because it would breed jealousy and enmity between them, competition. You could argue that in this instance, that would not apply, because we know something about Rachel and Leah. How is it possible that the deception happened? right? He thinks he's marrying Rachel, and it ends up being Leah. So we know our sages tell us that Yaakov, in fact, suspected maybe something untoward would be maneuvered and manipulated by Lavan. And therefore, he made a special signal, special sign, simanim, that he gave to Rachel to ensure and verify her identity. It's probably something like a social insurance number that he made up with her or something. In any case, we know our sages tell us that Rachel, because she felt bad for Leah, that she shouldn't be humiliated and she shouldn't go through a very embarrassing situation, she gave those signs over to Leah. So the Rebbe says, you're talking about Rachel and Leah, two sisters who were so close with each other. Rachel was even willing to give over these signs, and therefore let Leah assume her identity. There's no reason that one should be concerned that these two sisters, a marriage to these two sisters, will breed divisiveness and hatred and competitiveness. So ultimately, what we see from all of this, in summation, we had the question, how could Yaakov marry two sisters? We brought various explanations, whether it was because it was in the diaspora, because there was a conversion. There was the answer we gave about the divine command. But finally, the Rebbe, in a way, his answer, it's based on a complicated analysis of the status of the Avos and the Shav Mitzvah B'no Noach at that time. But ultimately, it comes down to a very simple calculation, a very simple formula. And that is to say, you have a choice. You could either look after your spiritual benefits, that which through this will enhance your spiritual standing and status. You have your chumras, you're looking after yourself. And then ultimately, there's a second consideration, that is the responsibility that you have towards another person, consideration for their feelings, consideration for the word that you gave them, and they're relying on you. And that was what Yaakov was considering. It wasn't just a halachic decision, but there was also a very, very deeply moral and ethical choice that he had to make. And what's the takeaway from all this? What's the lesson? Yaakov had, on the one hand, his selfish spiritual well-being, on the one hand, his chumrah, and then there is the consideration of the feelings and the well-being of another person. So if the bottom line is a person should not seek to grow and enhance their spiritual standing at the expense and on the account of another person. And oftentimes people and their priorities, they're so self-absorbed. And we're talking about not in a physical sense, in a spiritual sense. But oftentimes they don't realize that those decisions are affecting those around them. They tell the anecdote of the new son-in-law that came to his in-laws for Pesach. He wasn't so excited he wasn't sure about their chumras, about their level of scrupulousness when it comes to observing Pesach and being cautious for chametz and whatnot. And here he's sitting there at the Seder, and he's starting to eat some of the soup, and then he sees a little something in his soup. He looks closer, oy vey, it's a grain of rice, kidneys on Pesach, and he's going crazy. And then they bring out the next course, and he looks again, he sees another kernel, and he's beside himself. How could I have trusted these people to go and eat there for Pesach? Right afterwards, he runs over to the rabbi who made the shidduch. He says, I got involved in this family, and they don't, Pesach is nothing to them. The rabbi says, do me a favor. I see you're wearing your shtreimel. Please take it off your head and give it a good shake. And he takes the shtreimel, gives it a shake, and all of a sudden, many kernels of rice start falling out. He says, he realized these kernels of grain, of rice, when they were concluding the chuppah, there's customs for the people, they throw rice and various objects at the chassan and kala in great celebration, and some of them must have been stuck inside his shtreimel. And the rabbi, he looks at this new young chassan, and he tells him, before you start judging the kashrus and the frum level of another person, make sure to look in your own shtreimel, which is a very important lesson for many. The Talmud says about what we call a chassid shota, a chassid who is a fool, an imbecile. And he observes that there's this woman who is out there flailing in the ocean, drowning, and doesn't want to save this woman because it's deemed to be inappropriate for a man to go out and save the woman. Such a person is a chassid shota. You think you're really righteous, but you're really a fool. And this is something that we have to be very, very cognizant about. And there's a fascinating discussion in halacha, in fact, about this idea of sacrificing your own spiritual well-being for the sake of another person who may even be on a level that you would say, why should I surrender? Why should I give up my spirituality, my ruchnius, for another person? And there was once a person who wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he asked the Rebbe, tell me, what should I do? There's this minyan I pass every single morning on Shabbos in the morning, and it's made up of a bunch of people who are not religious, and they're trying to daven, and they want me to be their chazan, and they're trying to hurry up, and they want to actually go to work and desecrate the Shabbos. It doesn't seem appropriate that I should do that, but if I'm not going to help them out, they're not going to be able to have a minyan, and many of them won't daven. And the Rebbe tells him that ultimately, if you don't join their minyan, many of them will not daven. And this is something that he quotes. One of the sources that he quotes is there's the Ritva, who says that generally speaking, maybe a person shouldn't sin in order for another person, sin on another person's behalf. But sometimes, if it's not their fault, if it's not something that's of their own doing, they grew up in a background that they didn't have the proper education, the proper background. In that instance, he says a person is allowed to give up from their spiritual well-being for another person. And the Rebbe adds, not only are they allowed to, it's midas chasidus. This is the pious and the noble thing to do. And this idea is not just when we're talking about physical harm, to place yourself in physical harm to help another person. We're talking about spiritual harm, which, as it's brought in many sources, the spiritual harm and death, God forbid, is even worse, even more severe than the spiritual, than physical. So ultimately, what we see from this whole discussion, a fascinating insight, and that is Yaakov had his spiritual welfare. He was doing mitzvahs, he was which perfected and enhanced and elevated him. And for him to marry two sisters, he felt it was something that would ultimately compromise himself. And as we mentioned before from the Ramban, when they come to Eretz Yisrael, on the way over there, Rachel dies. And at least from that perspective, that's a symbol that there was something that was a challenge over there. But ultimately, from Yaakov's perspective, he says, it's not even a question. I gave my word. I'm not going to allow my religiosity and piety cause anguish and suffering to Rachel. And the truth is, you could ask the question, if so, how could Yaakov come and say, Im Lavan Garti, Tarig mitzvah Shemarti, observed all the mitzvahs. You married two sisters. How could you claim you fulfilled all 613? So the Rebbe says, it doesn't say Tarig mitzvahs Kiyamti, I observed all 613. It says Tarig mitzvahs Shemarti, I fulfilled. It says Shemarti, I guarded them, I observed them. Which means we have a concept in halacha sometimes that one mitzvah overrides another. There's a concept that pikuach nefesh, if there's a danger to a life, it overrides the entire Torah. So what happens here, it's not merely that we say, okay, there's one mitzvah here, there's another mitzvah, they're in conflict, so one will push the other one away. What we're saying is that the mitzvah itself is fulfilled by doing the other mitzvah. In other words, all mitzvahs are fulfilling Hashem's will. So sometimes I fulfill Hashem's will by doing the mitzvah. Sometimes I fulfill Hashem by not doing the mitzvah. And when I don't do the mitzvah and I do something else, or I do what I feel I shouldn't be doing, person says, I don't want to get into a car and drive on Shabbos, but the person's ill, chas v'shalom, right? So you shouldn't feel that you're compromising your relationship with Hashem. In fact, by violating, by desecrating the Shabbos, that is the fulfillment of Shabbos. The whole purpose of Shabbos, the whole purpose of the mitzvah is to promote life, is to promote our connection to Hashem. So sometimes what we're doing, it would appear we're distancing ourselves from Hashem. If we're doing it, now obviously based on Shulchan Aruch and based on the proper parameters of halacha, observing what the halacha tells us to do, then that is the ultimate fulfillment of the Torah. I will conclude. There was once a person who asked the Rebbe. It's known about on Shabbos, it's customary not to fold the talis on the folds, on the lines. It's considered somehow it's a tikkun of the beged. It's something that we're not supposed to do. So they roll it up on Shabbos. And on Motzei Shabbos, it's customary to fold the talis. And someone asked the Rebbe, is it true? It's a segula. It says that it's a segula for shalom bayis to fold the talis on Motzei Shabbos. And the Rebbe says, could be, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I did hear that washing the dishes, that is definitely a segula for shalom bayis. So sometimes we think that it is the religious and very, very pious things that we do for ourselves that will help and elevate and inspire those around us. But oftentimes it's not necessarily the things that look holy and spiritual. We roll up our sleeves and we help around and we reach out to another person. We stop thinking just about ourselves, but are open ourselves up to the plight and the well-being and the welfare of those around us. It lifts up hearts and inspires, and that itself brings all of the brachas that are needed in our homes, in our community, and indeed may we merit very soon through the efforts of reaching out to people. We should merit to the coming of Mashiach. B'mheira v'yameinu, amen.